Number one, have a language. So unless ants have a language and speak with one another, strictly speaking, we wouldn't consider them persons. We wouldn't. They might consider one another persons. But for us, we need a language, and that language enables you to think of yourself as a self with all sorts of definitions of who you are and so on. And those definitions are social. So what we're thinking about there is that do you have a private language? Can you have a private language? Can you create a language that's just meaningful to you? Or perhaps just your family? At that point, we say yes. Families can have codes speak or something with one another. But what helps and what's important there is that you have an other person that interacts with you by which you can make sure that what you meant to say to them was understood by them the way you meant it to be, so that communications is successful. And so language essentially is a social process as opposed to just something you can learn. How someone like Irving Finkel can sit down and study clay tablets from the Babylonian period and understand what they're trying to say, understand the different languages and so on. There's got to be other things involved because you can't just make that stuff up that way. You know what I mean? There's got to be some other ways that he interacts with the culture in order to understand what the clay tablets, what the cuneiform writing actually expresses. Right? But in order to be a person, you have to first go back and go to class notes. Items. What is a person? Remember we did this? You interact with other individuals, but you're defined by one another. You define in your social group what an individual is. And so our contemporary issue associated with what is a person requires us to have language and to be self-reflecting, to think of ourselves as a self. Remember the point at which you take you can do the mirror test, where the creature, say a child, recognizes itself by looking at the mirror instead of just seeing the reflection without understanding it. But when it is able to see its reflection and knows that it's looking at itself and passes that mirror test, seems to be at least a point where the child reaches around the terrible, we call them terrible twos. And why do we call them terrible? Why do we call them terrible twos? Anybody have a child or two experience the twos?
I worked at a daycare for like 2 years in the toddler phase.
So what makes them terrible twos?
They're really creatively mean.
Creatively mean. Do you remember being creatively mean when you were 2? That's a mean question, isn't it?
My dog was a nightmare with shoes too. And I remember hearing people say the terrible twos, and I didn't think it could be much worse than everything up until that point, but it did in fact get much worse. You turned into a dinosaur.
That brings up the whole question of, do dogs understand language? And I believe they do. And I believe they actually have a concept of self. When you say to the dog its name and you say, come here, the same thing with a child, come here. And at 2, the child can say no. Right? And that's what dogs can do too. They can say, no, I'm not coming. So that's a good point. And that's exactly it. What happens at the Terrible Twos is that a child now all of a sudden is capable of imagining the opposite. I'm actually quoting at this point. Let's do it. So take a minute to load. And I should actually explain who Hegel is before I continue on, I suppose. So let me do Hegel. So Georg Wilhelm Friedrich. His wife just called him Hegel, though, so whatever you want to call him. Notice he's born 1770. That's kind of easy. So he was 6 when the Declaration of Independence was signed in the city of Philadelphia, right? Dies at 1831, so he's 61, basically. Born at Stuttgart. He's a Schwab. If you're from Germany, a Schwab is a particular area of Germany where they're kind of rural, and it's kind of like the equivalent of Mississippi in the United States, maybe, roughly. Does that make sense? Anybody from Mississippi? No. Oh well. There are people from Mississippi. I've met them, and they say, "How ye?" You know, and y'all is actually an expression. Okay, that's enough from Mississippi. But in any case, the Schwabs. There are people that make fun of the Schwabs in Germany because that kind of rural attitude. Seems to be. So there's for example the Siebenschwaben. That's they're actually proud of it. See if I can find it. Okay, so I don't know if you can see. There's actually a statue. I was looking for the statue. Oh, go back. Let's go for the statue. Okay, so you get there's a statue. I don't know if you can make it out. You make it out. There's 7 Schwaben, Swopes, right? All lined up with one spear, and they're afraid of a rabbit. I don't know if you can see there's a rabbit up in the front of the statue. So they make fun. They make fun of the Schwabs in Germany. In any case, so smart kid though ends up going doing well in school, and he ends up going to Tübingen. To the Tübingen Stift. Let's see if we get it in there. So here's Tübingen, Stuttgart, Tübingen. Tübingen, by the way, still has a great university there today. It's one of those towns that wasn't destroyed in World War II because it was so kind of rural and old. No special tactical value, so no one tried to blow it up. They left it pretty much as it is. So if you went to visit old German towns, you could go to Tübingen. And the university. And here's a building in Tübingen. I don't know which room it is, but in Tübingen University or Stift, it's a seminary, really. 3 individuals were all they were roommates in the university. Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin. and it's kind of neat because all three of them are going to become world famous. Hölderlin, by some, is considered to be the greatest German poet that ever lived, although, of course, you know what it's like saying someone's the greatest of whatever. Who's going to all agree? Schelling and Hegel both are philosophers. Schelling is really the one who becomes famous first, and Hegel afterwards. And because of the things that evolved between them, they ended up not having a good relationship for a while. Maybe it even ended that way. But we'll talk about that. Okay, so Hegel. Well, as I said, Schelling is the first one to be really successful, and Schelling starts teaching early, even though he's 5 years younger than Hegel, and ends up nonetheless teaching ahead of time. Hegel spends 7 years after he graduates as a tutor in homes of rich people, some in Switzerland, some in Frankfurt, but in any case, he ends up at that point, his father dies and he inherits some money, and as a result, he doesn't have to stay as a tutor to make money. He instead moves to Jena with his friend Schelling, who's teaching at the University of Vienna, and he becomes a teacher as well, although he's like an adjunct, so he just gets paid for whatever courses students come to. So that's how he works there. And he's there, and they're working on a journal. They're involved in the philosophical movements that occurred at the time. Part of that was because of Gottlob Fichte, who's kind of in between Kant and this generation. So let's mention him. In fact, if you ever have a chance to visit Berlin, and you go to the cemetery, which is just near the University of the main University of Berlin, which is Humboldt University. Dorothea Platz, where the cemetery is, has Fichte's grave, and right next to it is Hegel's grave. You know, they did that on purpose. What do you think? Would their grave be on here? Maybe not. So this is I think this is Fichte's grave, and this is his wife's grave. But if you saw a bigger picture of the area, you would see that Hegel's grave and his wife's grave are right next to them. So that's kind of interesting. But so Fichte. Let me try to explain where Fichte fits in this. It's actually kind of nice. Remember, Kant gives a solution to David Hume's dilemma. That is, that we can only know what's present to our minds at the moment. But something has to structure that experience. And Hume points out that you can't actually get outside of the experience to find out what it is. So therefore you can't do metaphysics. Kant argues, well, we must be able to do metaphysics, so how do we do it? And the mind is what structures our experience. So for Kant, the a priori, what happens before, a priori means before, a posteriori means after. So what happens before we have an experience is our mind is already structured to perceive something. We would agree with this completely today. For Kant, though, what is it that structures the mind? He doesn't really get into it. He talks about the categories, So he reverts back to the Aristotelian categories that have been part of European culture ever since, really, especially the reintroduction of Aristotle after the Renaissance, really. You end up with those categories, basically the same that Aristotle used, and instead of applying them to the things in themselves, now those categories are